Have you ever wondered what happens when an empath, someone endlessly gentle, forgiving, and kind, finally stops enduring? Carl Jung, the great psychoanalyst, once warned of a phenomenon too unsettling for most to name. When an empath is hurt for too long, too deeply, they don't collapse, they transform. This isn't some cheap personality change like in TV dramas. It's a psychological metamorphosis, a turning point where light no longer shines outward, but instead absorbs the darkness just to survive. Jung called this one of his most frightening discoveries, because it doesn't happen to the wicked, it happens to those who once sacrificed, forgave, and silently carried the pain of others, as if it were their duty. So what happens when they stop enduring? What do they do with all the pain that has been accumulating inside them? Do they remain healers, or have they become what Jung described as the bearer of darkness? This video isn't for the faint of heart, but if you've ever given until you were empty, you might be standing at the threshold of a transformation you haven't yet dared to name. Stay. You need to understand what's happening to yourself. In psychology, we often hear about two dangerous types of people: the narcissist, someone who always puts themselves first and treats others as tools to inflate their ego, and the psychopath, cold, detached, and utterly unremorseful when causing harm. But there's another kind, far more dangerous, because they're harder to recognize. They are the dark empaths, people who possess deep empathy, yet also carry within them a shadow they know exactly how to use, when necessary. A dark empath isn't emotionless. They still love, they still connect, but they don't give blindly anymore. They choose carefully. They observe quietly. And if you've ever hurt them, they'll know exactly where to touch, which emotional nerve to strike to make you crumble. Not because they're cruel, but because they've felt too much for too long. Unlike the narcissist, who only pretends to care for self-serving reasons, the dark empath truly understands others. They can see straight through you, sometimes even better than you understand yourself. That makes them either a powerful protector or a lesson you'll never want to repeat, depending on how you treat them. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." Dark empaths are born from such collisions, when a once soft soul is forced to harden. When a healer learns the cost of endless giving and finally discovers the need for self-defense. They weren't born to hurt anyone, but over time they've mastered one crucial lesson: how to make sure no one can ever hurt them again. And because of that transformation, the dark empath is no longer just a psychological concept. They've become a familiar presence in popular culture. Characters who both frighten and move us. Characters in whom we often see a reflection of ourselves. Take Loki, the trickster of the Marvel universe. He isn't a cold-blooded villain. On the contrary, he understands people too deeply. He can make you laugh, feel, and then ache. Loki doesn't harm for pleasure. He acts from the pain of having once loved and been denied love in return. As he once said, "I never wanted the throne. I only ever wanted to be your equal." That is the voice of someone who longed to be seen, but grew too tired of begging for affection from a world that refused to give it. Batman carries that same shadow. Bruce Wayne doesn't kill, but he knows that light alone cannot save his city. He wears his trauma like armor, using the pain of losing his parents as fuel to step into places others fear to go. He is the silent, lonely kind of dark empath, driven by justice, not approval. And Severus Snape, the brooding professor of Harry Potter, might be the clearest example of all. Snape loved deeply, but chose to protect that love by hiding within the dark. When he said always, it wasn't just a confession, it was a vow. I have loved, and I have chosen to bear every wound that love demanded, to keep it safe. Carl Jung once wrote, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." Loki, Batman, and Snape are living proof of that truth. And the most haunting part? People like them don't exist only in stories. They might be the person sitting next to you, or you yourself, if you've ever been forced to become strong one too many times. If characters like Loki or Snape make us feel both compassion and fear, there's a reason. They weren't born that way. They were once good, sincere, trusting, loving. But repeated wounds changed them. Their kindness was twisted, compressed, and in the end forced to grow fangs just to survive. No one is born a dark empath. No child dreams of using empathy to control or retaliate against others. But after giving too much and receiving too little, after being called too sensitive, too emotional, too weak, after their feelings were dismissed again and again, something in them closed. Not because they stopped feeling, but because they could no longer live the same way. Their heart didn't die, it evolved. It became smarter, more discerning, and fiercely protective. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole by embracing both the light and the shadow within. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The dark empath is the embodiment of that truth. They don't run from their darkness. They face it, learn from it, and wield it to survive in a world that too often punishes kindness. If the empath heals with light, the dark empath heals by carrying the darkness without letting it consume them. And that's what makes them dangerous, but also essential in a world that desperately needs balance. And because they learn to save themselves in a world that never came to their rescue, the empath begins to change. But they don't become evil. They become something that can't be defined by old moral standards. That's when the dark empath emerges, a psychological hybrid between light and shadow, between compassion and power. Dark empaths possess deep empathy, yet also embody traits from what psychology calls the dark triad: Machiavellianism, strategic, calculating; narcissism, self-sophist, sensitive to hurt; and psychopathy, cold, emotionally detached. But unlike psychopaths, they don't lose their emotions, and unlike narcissists, they aren't consumed by ego. They still love, just not blindly. They still care, but with precision. Carl Jung called this process the integration of the shadow. In Aeon, he wrote, "To confront a person with their shadow is to show them their own light." A dark empath is someone who has looked straight into their shadow and learned to use it. They don't just feel what others feel, they know what to do with those feelings. When needed, they can comfort a suffering soul or strike back with surgical accuracy using the very wound you once gave them. They often use sarcastic humor, not as cruelty, but as a mirror of their deep psychological insight. They have a way of making those who hurt them feel guilt, not through shouting, but through silence, a steady gaze, or a single quiet line that cuts sharper than a blade. They aren't emotionless. In fact, they often carry shame, self-awareness, and guilt, like any true empath. But instead of letting pain destroy them, they fold it inward, shaping it into a hidden dagger, resting calmly in their palm, ready to use if the world turns cruel again. Dangerous? Perhaps. But when everyone else is still pretending to be good, it's often the dark empath who finally has the courage to rise. And once they've folded their pain into a blade, the dark empath is no longer a passive observer in the emotional battlefield. They've studied the psychological map of others, not to manipulate for pleasure, but to survive and reclaim control. They don't just have traits, they embody them, in ways that are unmistakable if you know what to look for. Carl Jung never used the term dark empath, but he described its essence precisely through the process of shadow integration. In Psychology and Alchemy, he wrote, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, and here's how that shadow reveals itself. First, they understand people too quickly, too deeply. With a single glance or a faint frown, they can feel the anger you haven't voiced, the sadness you haven't shown. But unlike ordinary empaths, they don't rush to heal you. They store the information, observe, and use it, if necessary. Second, they make others feel guilty without raising their voice. No blame, no shouting, just presence, and suddenly you feel wrong without knowing why. Third, they set unbreakable boundaries without anger. You cross the line once, and there won't be a second time. Their coldness doesn't come from pain, but from clarity. Fourth, they're no longer ruled by other people's emotions. They can watch you suffer without immediately rushing to save you. They wait to see if you'll stand on your own and whether you deserve their help. Fifth, when they strike, it's swift, precise, and final. They don't fight to win, they fight to end. Because they've learned this truth, some boundaries can only be protected by fire. Otherwise, they'll keep being trampled by polite words. Because they can read emotions instantly and react with sharp precision, a dark empath is no longer the fragile soul who simply endures. They are something far more unsettling, the result of a good person pushed past their limits. Someone who once loved unconditionally until life taught them the cost. To understand a dark empath, don't just look at who they are now. Ask instead, what broke the person who once smiled easily, forgave quickly, and cared too much? What happened to turn gentleness into clarity and compassion into power? Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." For empaths, that pain comes from giving endlessly and receiving nothing. They become the emotional dumping ground for others' anger, fear, and selfishness, until one day, they can't carry it anymore. The problem is that pain doesn't disappear. It accumulates in fragments of memory, in every ignored word, in every quiet act of exploitation. And when it finally erupts, they don't collapse, they reconstruct themselves, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, as an act of survival. From that point on, they're no longer the naive good person. They still feel deeply, but they no longer soothe everyone. They understand pain and know exactly what to do with it. If you're genuine, they'll give you everything. But if you've ever used them, they'll become the one who ensures you never do it to anyone again. Carl Jung feared this transformation, not because it was evil, but because he understood. When good people are pushed to their breaking point, they don't become victims, they become weapons. Weapons that think, feel, and know precisely who deserves forgiveness and who doesn't. And when an empath reaches the end of their limits, they're no longer soft in the way they once were. They become clear-minded, selective, and sometimes cold. They still feel others' pain, still possess compassion, but now it's reserved only for those they deem worthy. And that, Carl Jung believed, is what makes them truly frightened. Jung wasn't afraid of evil people. He feared those who were once kind, forgiving, and healing, but who, after too much pain, stopped tolerating it. They looked directly into their own darkness and learned how to use it. As he wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That is the essence of the dark empath. They no longer seek to please everyone. They no longer crave approval. They know their limits and exactly who is allowed to cross them and who isn't. So, are dark empaths good or bad? It's hard to say. They can heal others with piercing empathy, yet also destroy someone with a few perfectly timed words, if they believe it's necessary. Not out of cruelty, but out of self-protection, forged by years of being hurt and finally learning how to stop the cycle. Jung never publicly detailed what he observed in such people. Perhaps he understood that society wasn't ready to face those whose kindness was no longer unconditional. And if you've started to feel yourself changing, growing sharper, harder, more discerning after everything, then you're likely standing in that very threshold yourself. The question isn't whether you're good or bad. The question is, who will you choose to heal, and who will you choose to end?